Oh, Michael, remember me? I do. Well, bless you. Good to see you. I don't want to. I don't want to say a little bit of hair ago, but yeah. So I was like, transparent, Randy. You can see it in the right light. It's very good. Okay, okay, got it. Randy Fortune. Yeah, you know, no, I just said I got to see. I just. Okay, I'm gonna grab it. Please go ahead. Where are you these days? I'm full time.
Yeah.
You were at Goldman Sachs. You were at Goldman Sachs, right? Goldman, and then I came back to Evergreen. Big dinner tomorrow. With Raytheon. Right. Going back into government. I was. Yeah. Really? Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Atlantic Council. My name is Daniel Chu. I am Deputy Director of the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security here at the Council. I also run something we call the Strategy Initiative here at the Council. The Strategy Initiative is really focused on encouraging a more substantive and constructive discussion of longer-term, bigger picture issues, particularly in the political discourse today, and particularly in a particularly difficult presidential election cycle for us. We think it's very important to address these larger-term issues. One of the major underlying themes of this strategy initiative is the divergence between how the world works, things that are happening in the world today, and how our strategy has traditionally been formulated and our government is structured to both think about and implement it. As such, thinking very hard about how government structure and processes may need to change in order to better deal with the world as it is changing as well is a really fundamental element of what we're doing here at the Council and what the Strategy Initiative is doing. This is why I'm particularly proud to have had an opportunity to work with an incredible group of people on a report that I think is going to be very, very important in advancing this issue of how the U.S. government may need to think about changing to address the world as it is today. As you all know, we have a report here today called the National Security Council Reform Projects, a foundational proposal for the next administration. This is a great report that has an incredible core team associated, including Ambassador Chester Crocker, Ambassador David Miller, Ambassador Tom Pickering, and Dan Levin, who have all really formed this core group and interviewed just a phenomenal group of over 60 senior former foreign policy, defense, intelligence, and congressional leaders to really come up with some observations and considerations, recommendations for the National Security Council going forward. I'll just say two things very briefly before turning over to the group itself. One is this is critically an issue. We've heard about national security reform in the news over and over, and the challenges that national security councils have been having across administrations, across parties, in managing the challenges of the world today. Particularly on a morning like this, where we have phenomenal news about changes in some of our expectations and assumptions about not only how the world works, but how perhaps even some of our closest alliances and partnerships may be working in the future. Addressing this issue is extremely timely. And as heading into our next presidential election and a new administration, it's going to be extremely important to have this discussion now. Secondly, I will say this is the beginning of this discussion. This is not the end of this discussion. I think all of the members of this team would agree that these are important, as stated in the title of the document, foundational proposals, but this is not the end of this discussion, and there is much more to be had. So I'm very glad that you're here to join us for this. We are very much going to take this event as more of a conversation than just a presentation, so we hope you will join in with your comments and your questions as we go along. We will begin this particular event. We're very honored to have two former national security advisors to provide some opening comments as we begin this discussion. We, of course, have with us first Mr. Stephen Hadley, who is, of course, former national security advisor under President George W. Bush, founding principal at Rice, Hadley, and Gates, and has been a strong friend and good partner to the Atlantic Council. And I've had the great pleasure of having the opportunity to work with him for some time, and very much appreciated that. Likewise, General Jim Jones, founder and president of Jones Group International, former national security advisor under President Obama, and again, not only a great friend to the council, chairman of the board for the Scowcroft Center on International Security, and again, I've had the great opportunity to work with him over the past year and a half, and it's been a great pleasure. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Mr. Hadley, I'll hand over to you to kick us off, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. I just want to say that I appreciate very much this paper that is being rolled out today, and which hopefully you have gotten on your way in. It has a set of very strong recommendations, and I think it's very timely, and I hope it gets broad dissemination and lots of consideration and ultimately implementation. It is part of a broader NSC reform effort that is being done here at the Atlantic Council, so there are more installments to come, so stay tuned. I really want to make three comments, and then I'll turn it over to my friend and colleague, General Jones. One, I agree with the focus in the report on the mission of the NSC, the mission of the National Security Advisor and of the National Security Council staff. In my view, the mission is fairly limited. It is first to staff and support the President as he or she exercises their constitutional role over national security and foreign policy. And that means helping prepare the President for meetings, help plan trips, help write speeches, writing briefing memos, supporting the President for meetings with counterparts and international travel. Second, it is to advocate and advance presidential initiatives within the executive branch. If the National Security Advisor and the National Security Council staff are not actively promoting the President's agenda, nobody else will. Third, it is coordinating important initiatives that require multiple departments and agencies to work together in coordination to achieve a common goal. This is on the input side, developing options for a presidential decision, and then once that decision is made, overseeing the implementation and execution. Not doing the implementation and execution, but overseeing it within the government, assigning responsibility, setting deadlines, and holding agencies and departments accountable for meeting them. And finally, I would say the National Security Advisor and the NSC staff need to inject a sense of urgency into the interagency process. The normal course of business is not enough when you have as many challenges as the country faces today. And secondly, inserting a sense of strategy in the interagency process. I cannot tell you how many meetings I have sat through in my career where 45 minutes into a 50-minute meeting, someone finally says, well, what are we trying to do here? And the National Security Advisor and the NSC staff should insist that at every meeting you start with that question. What are we trying to do, and how are we going to do it? Because that's really what strategy is all about. I would say to a National Security Advisor and an NSC staff member, if you are doing something that does not fit in one of those four categories, stop. Stop. Because so defined, if, and General Jones is going to talk about this, if you have senior experienced people staffing your NSC staff, you can perform these four missions with a smaller, modest-sized staff, somewhere between 125, 175. But again, the size of the staff is something for the President to set. It is not something for the Congress of the United States to legislate. Second, I also agree with the report and its focus on the Scowcroft model as the place to start. If you are a national security advisor, if you have the opportunity and responsibility for that job, think Brent Scowcroft and use him as the model. And of course, it's famously the honest broker model. That means a lot of things. One of the things I would say, and I would urge any incoming national security advisor, I like the emphasis in the report on developing options for the President. Sometimes as National Security Advisor, you have this sense that, well, I'm just going to sit down with the principals and I'm not going to knock their heads together and we're going to come up with a consensus. And then I, as the National Security Advisor, will present that consensus to the President. I think that's the wrong instinct. And I think the right instinct is work with the National Security Council principals to develop options and then take those options with the principals to the President for decision. Because of the national security principles, the President and the Vice President are the only ones elected by the American people to make decisions. And they should be making the decisions based on options from the NSC. Finally, I would say I think we need to rethink the NSC system. It is basically unchanged from the system that Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski established in the 1960s and 1970s. And if you look at the multiplicity of issues that the country faces today in national security and foreign policy, you cannot possibly funnel all those issues through a White House-centric interagency process. There isn't enough bandwidth. And as a consequence, an issue will get to the top of the White House agenda only when it's come to the point of crisis. And unfortunately, if it doesn't come until it is at a time of crisis, most of the soft power options are in the rearview mirror. It's too late. And many times you're stuck with either doing something with the military or doing nothing at all. And if you wait and all you're doing is manage crises, then all you're going to get is more crises because you're not putting in place policies that will shape the future and avoid crises. I think we need to relook and rethink the NSC staff organization and how it's operating. I think the NSC needs to focus on strategy and broad policy guidance. It needs then for implementation and execution of that strategy and guidance to empower and enable cabinet officials, senior military officers, the nation's diplomats, our intelligence officers, to let them do the implementation and execution under the oversight of senior policymakers, but without tactical control. Give people responsibility, hold them accountable, and then let them do their jobs. And finally, be careful about technology. I remember, and General Jones had the same experience, we had a a dust-up between Pakistan and India that could have led to a nuclear standoff. And we had meetings in the Situation Room with the president, and we had our NATO ambassador, we had our ambassador in India, our ambassador in Pakistan, we had the CENTCOM commander. I mean, we had everybody on the screen and all the principals in the room, and it was very effective as a crisis management tool to keep people knit up and to move quickly. Resist the temptation to use that for normal policy, because it'll mean that the White House is into the tactics and not letting the men and women of our various services and diplomats and intelligence officers do their job. Anyway, those are some initial thoughts. General Jones has some more for you. I think the report is a very good start, and I would say there's more coming on this subject from the Atlantic Council. Jim?
Steve, thanks very much for those comments. As usual, you and I are in violent agreement. I would simply say that that I think that the NSC is one of the first orders of business that any incoming president needs to deal with. It's absolutely essential that the president formulate early on exactly how that the NSC is going to be not only used but constructed. And there are several different models that can apply. But the importance of it is paramount, in my opinion. And therefore, the first thing that happens before an inauguration, of course, is the turnover. And I would strongly recommend that the next administration consult with Steve Hadley on how to turn over an NSC, because I think his turnover to our version of the NSC was exactly what needs to be done, with the right spirit, the right tone, and the right amount of issues that the incoming president needs to be concerned with from day one. So I think the turnover is extremely important, and that's something that the next president ought to be thinking about pretty quickly. Secondly, I would say that one of the things that I think we did that was correct was combine Homeland Security and national security. I think there was it was a moment in time when that needed to be done. It became increasingly difficult to see where Homeland Security started and national security ended, and so that part of it was one of the reasons that contributed to the growth and the size of the NSC. I would caution against being fixated on numbers for the NSC. I strongly agree with Steve saying that it ought not to be legislated, but it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be discussed. And any discussion gets back around and say, what do you want the NSC to do? The NSC, in a globalized environment where national security issues are in greater abundance than they were 20 or 30 years ago, and they involve multiple agencies. I can't think of a single major crisis going on in the world right now that doesn't include several agencies in our government: Treasury, State, Energy, Commerce, the intelligence community, the law enforcement community, defense. And so you need, this country is going to need an organization that is able to manage the coordination between those agencies, particularly in the 4 levels of decision-making or discussions that you have in the NSC, starting with the senior directors, the deputies committee, the principals, and finally the full NSC. That's not a bad system. What I've noticed in my time in the NSC and out of the NSC is how many more issues there are on the plate of the National Security Advisor. I'm sure Steve did the same thing, but virtually every day as National Security Advisor, I used to come in and I'd take out a notepad and I'd say, okay, what are what are the things that the president absolutely needs to know about? And I would do that every single day with the senior staff. And we'd come up with about 12 to 14 issues that absolutely were presidential level interest items. I still do that every now and then, and I come up now with 20 or 24 or 25 things. So the world has gotten much more complicated. And the other thing that is important, and it gets to Steve's comments about how some changes have to be made in the NSC, and that is a function of speed. In other words, things are happening at a cyclic rate that is faster than ever before, and time available to deal with those. And in the current model of the NSC, we work our tails off from sunup to well after sundown. But at some point, people go home and go to sleep. And during that period of time, bad things happen. That the next day, 6 hours later, when you get back in, ready to go again, you spend your time dealing with that. So there are portions of the NSC right now that are almost working around the clock, and they have shifts. And that's something that I think we're going to have to think about, because there's just not enough bandwidth right now to handle everything that comes across the table at the NSC. Structure is important, and resourcing of that structure is important. I come down on the side that one of the problems the NSC has, or certainly had while I was a national security advisor, is the rotation of people out of the NSC. During my time, we had roughly, seemed to me, about 2/3 of the people who were detailees from other agencies, and about 1/3 was what I would call permanent staff. I think that's the exact opposite of what's needed. I think you need to have high-quality senior directors, really experts in the field, and they form the anchor for the permanency or consistency of the NSC. And the detailees ought to be about 1/3 of the size of the NSC and be managed in a way that you're not reinventing the wheel every year. And with that goes a properly sized budget. And that we always struggle with in the White House. But it's absolutely imperative that the National Security Council have a travel budget, have not, I won't say an entertainment budget, but I mean to be able to offer guests coffee or a meal or something like that in the White House that's planned for. And those kinds of things have been not particularly well addressed over the years that I was a national security advisor. And finally, I would just simply say that I think the lesson learned of every administration is that when the NSC departs the pattern from what it's supposed to be doing, which is strategic, and gets involved in the micromanagement of affairs at the tactical level or even at the operational level, then that NSC is no longer providing the best service it can to the president. And that should be guarded against in every administration. The NSC should not be a tactical operation. It should be strategic. It should focus itself on the things that are absolutely important to the President of the United States. I do think that that developing options is an acceptable outcome. You're not going to get unanimous agreement on every issue on every day. And sometimes you have to say, here are the options. And I think it's the role of the National Security Advisor to be able to represent the equities of the cabinet, members who are assembled around the table and providing those options. And when asked, the National Security Advisor should give his or her opinion to the President. In my case, I asked the President not to call on me in the Situation Room for my opinion, because I wanted to build a relationship with the members of the cabinet that was one that was built on trust, so that when they're not there, if the president said, by the way, how does the Secretary of State feel about this? You know what that position is, and you can represent that. And then in those instances when the president wants your personal opinion, you can give it to him. But in my view, it should be in the privacy of his office. So I applaud the report and its broad recommendations. It's the first of more work that needs to be done. If it serves the purpose of focusing the principal candidates on what it is they must be thinking about, then I think that's a good thing, and I'm happy and honored to have been a part of it. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, General Jones and Steve Hadley. Appreciate your openers. Great food for thought. I'm Paula Dobriansky. I'm on the Atlanta Council Board, and also formerly earlier on in my career, worked 7 years at the National Security Council staff. And I want to congratulate the Atlanta Council and its authors for this outstanding report. By the way, I'd like to mention up front that we're very sorry that Colonel Jason Kirby, who was Chief of Staff to this effort, couldn't be here with us today, but I understand his wife is here with us. So please do send the message. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And let me invite the panelists up, if I may. I'll begin with Ambassador David Miller, who you're going to hear from first, who is partner with Torch Hill Investment Partners and was formerly ambassador to Tanzania and Zimbabwe. All of these authors, by the way, served on the NSC staff. After Ambassador Miller, you're going to see by video Ambassador Chet Crocker, professor at Georgetown, formerly on the NSC staff, and also a former Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. Then we hope by phone you're going to hear Ambassador Tom Pickering, another author, career ambassador, 7 ambassadorships. And then we'll hear from Daniel Levin, who's a partner with White Case and was legal advisor to the NSC. So let me invite them up to the stage, and Ambassador Miller, you're going to kick us off. Please join me in welcoming them and thanking them.
I guess the theory is we do have Tom Pickering on the phone.
Yes, you do.
Yes. Listen, to try to herd this group for a couple of years worth of research was really quite good fun most of the time. Tom, it's wonderful that you're with us. And after listening to Steve and General Jones, I had the distinct impression that what I should say is simply listen to these guys and then I would sit down. There was a huge amount of wisdom that just came from these two men who have run the NSC. It is a difficult, it's not thankless, but it's hard. And I hope you all recognize the value of what you've just heard. I have the task today of explaining the study, how we did it, why we did it, and then we'll have Tom and Dan and Chet comment on the recommendations. I do want to offer a very special thanks to the Atlantic Council. When we got here to the Scowcroft Center, as I described us to Barry and Dan, we were sort of the local pickup soccer team on some dirty lot, and we'd been kicking the ball around for 1.5 years. And as my wife said, we had produced absolutely fascinating reading on the NSC that would hold the attention of at least 50 people who cared deeply about National Security Council management, but it was pretty dry. The Atlantic Council, with a superb job by Jason Kirby, really took our material, improved it a lot. The Atlantic Council ran seminars, improved the editing, found pictures to make some of our stuff seem relevant. And so it's hard to make the NSC exciting. A very special thanks there. You will note there are also 11 people from the private sector listed way in the back of the book. We have called upon some investment friends to offer their thoughts on management and the selection of personnel. And the folks you see listed there have all agreed to work with us for a period of time. About half of them run major funds, and about the other half are corporate chairmen. And we look forward to learning from them. I wanted to offer at the outset a comment that is aimed at, if you will, meant to comment on the current NSC. Everybody who works at the NSC works exceptionally hard. And this is a town that can take almost any document and turn light into heat and waste an opportunity for a constructive dialogue. This report is not focused only on this NSC. It is focused on National Security Council management over a number of decades. The current NSC is, in fact, implementing a lot of the pieces of the report that you see. Susan Rice has been reducing staff, and there is a strategic function now at the NSC. We don't mean to imply in this report that there is not a strategic function there. We included a strong emphasis on the strategic function because so many of the people that we interviewed said you've got to keep that function growing. It's got to be robust. And the bottom line is, as Steve and I had discussed, our dear friend Brent Scowcroft, who was on the Tower Commission many years ago when the Iran-Contra confusion occurred, led the charge against saying Congress should not impose any detailed restrictions on the National Security Council, and we're getting back into an era where that's being discussed. Our group would not support that. We look forward to working with everybody on the Hill, but you should know that if Brent were here, he would be standing here behind me with a gun to my head. And if I said anything other than that, you would witness an execution in public. So to the basics of how this occurred. Why did we do this? We spent 2 years talking to ourselves and trying to figure out what was going on. The motivation for this study was quite straightforward. Many senior Americans who had worked in a number of different White Houses, worked at cabinet level positions, were critical of the performance of the United States in terms of managing foreign policy, military force projection, and coordinating our international efforts. So we said to ourselves, if that many senior people are concerned, we ought to take a serious look at what was occurring. So how did we go about the study? It basically came together the way old foreign policy people come together. You start phoning friends and saying, well, what do you think? What should we do? And we reached the first important conclusion, and that is there's always criticism. These two guys in the front row know that better than anybody. No matter what you do at the NSC, people will be critical. That just comes with the territory. I remember in my day, every editorial board in America knew that we could get Nelson Mandela off Robben Island quicker. We could rescue hostages in Beirut more efficiently. And we were just starting the drug war, and everybody in America had an opinion on the drug war and what could be done better or worse. So we wanted to see if there was a pattern to the criticism. We also thought we should limit our exploration to the National Security Council. If the NSC is working well, the government, the executive branch in general, works better. If the NSC is not working well, I have used the analogy of congestive heart failure. It's not that the executive departments are going to quit. they just don't work as well. And so we started off by saying we're going to focus on the NSC. We then made a decision that all the interviews and all the meetings would be conducted by the principals themselves. Much as I love graduate students, and Chet Crocker still teaches graduate students, we thought if you wanted to have a candid conversation about what was really going on, that you needed to have principals interviewing other people who were principals. Frequently, the folks we were interviewing held jobs that we had held ourselves. And with that, we think we got some fairly candid commentary. When we began, we thought we would isolate the interviews by groups. We would interview Uniformed Services, OSD, the State Department, lawyers, so on and so forth, to see if there was some coincidence of commentary. If there was no coincidence of the observations of the issues we faced, then there are no solutions. If it's simply random noise, there isn't really much you can do about that. So we set out to interview. It is interesting that the recommendations that you're looking at grew out of interviews with Sandy Berger and Brzezinski, General Powell, of course, Steve and General Jones, and at the back of it all was, as always, General Scowcroft providing advice and guidance in terms of what we might do. We've interviewed General Mattis, General Allen, General Cartwright, General Newbold, Admiral Stavridis, Admiral Blair, Vice Admiral Bob Harward, and on and on. So how do we view our final product and recommendations? I have used the following analogies. This report is like the owner's manual for the NSC. We have tried to describe characteristics of successful NSCs. You have heard them eloquently discussed by Steve and General Jones. But this is really, it's the Boston Patriots playbook. This is Belichick's rules of how you win. So we basically went back over that history, and we've tried to capture for everybody how you run a successful NSC. In the middle of that, we did come up with one particularly important observation, which was tangential in some ways to foreign policy, and that is the need for consistent and thoughtful development of legal policy that provides the framework for force projection, intelligence activities, and the behavior of the State Department. And so we asked Dan Levin if he would write a particular report on the management of executive branch foreign policy legal decisions. With that, I think I'm through. I suspect you all found the process fascinating. But it is important when you read this to understand that we've captured the inputs of essentially 60 or 70 very senior people. And it was not done on a whim. So pay attention to it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So next we go to the video to see Ambassador Chet Crocker.
Well, I'm very pleased to have a chance to talk with you about the National Security Council Reform Project, which has been hosted here at the Atlantic Council. It's a very important and timely project. And what's been stunning to me as we've gone through the many interviews that our core team has done, these are interviews with a bipartisan set of veteran players in all the key agencies and in the National Security Council staff itself. What's been stunning to me is the amount of common ground that we have found. And it's not been common ground against any particular administration or any particular political party. It's really been quite bipartisan. We recognize that any national security council system will be the system that the next president wants. And he or she will choose the kind of system that he or she wants. But that said, there's some things that we have encountered, some very substantial consensus that we've encountered, that it's clear that there's some things that one shouldn't do and some things that one should do. So let me just run down quickly a few of the key takeaways from this project. I think the most important point is to get straight what the mandate and the mission of the National Security Council system is, and to recognize that the size of the NSC staff has a very direct implication for what that mission and mandate will be. The larger the staff is, the more likely it is to slide or slip or be directed into an operational role. The NSC staff, the NSC system was never intended to become a mini foreign ministry located in the White House. And it never was intended to be there to micromanage or to undercut the role of the major line departments in our foreign policy and our defense policy. Those departments obviously are state defense and the intelligence community and increasingly the Treasury Department. So those departments and their leaders need to be empowered by the NSC system in order to get their candid views across to the president. Of course, the NSC system also exists to make sure that presidential guidance, the strategic vision of a president, is transmitted out to the agencies and departments so they know what the broad parameters are. But the NSC staff is not intended to be a micromanaging operational staff. Unfortunately, over the last 20 years or so, it has gradually evolved into a more operational staff. It's gotten far too big in the judgment of most everybody we talk to. It is 2 or 3 times the size today that it ought to be. And the result of that, let me just quickly spell out what the result of that is. One result is that there's a sense of isolating the president from his own senior departmental officials. It also prevents the most seasoned professional veterans in the departments and agencies, uniformed and civilian, from being able to participate and get their views across to the White House. It creates kind of a screen or a buffer or a filter, which unfortunately makes it less likely that the most experienced and professional voices will be heard. Any president worth her or his salt wants to hear more than one voice. The NSC system can exist in order to make sure that the key voices do get across to the president, and where there are conflicts, to help and try and resolve those conflicts, but in any event, to empower the leading figures in the cabinet and their direct subordinates to participate in the policy process. So we believe that size, to coin a phrase, matters, and that the mission and the mandate of the NSC should be structured accordingly. And this is a very important point in the first few months of a new administration, to get the mandate, the mission, and the size properly decided and structured. We also believe strongly that one of the things that is often missing when you have a highly White House-centric NSC operation is a temptation to get dragged into the everyday or every hour micromanaging of tactics to deal with the media. And with a 24-hour news cycle, there is that temptation. It's really a problem. And one way to rise above that is to insist within the NSC staff that there is a function that could be called strategic planning. And that function, maybe 3 to 5 people, should serve to integrate strategic planning ideas that come from the interagency, as well as the ideas that come from within the staff, so that there is a real sense of thinking not just about the 24-hour news cycle, but what is it that the president got elected to do? What is it that she or he wants to see our country able to participate in? What kind of priorities over the long term should be established? And then a final point that I would stress is the importance of creating a structure which enables, in appropriate cases, the lead departments to actually be lead departments and to serve as leaders of interagency task forces and working groups that are capable of running policy in a particular field. The NSC's job is to monitor execution and make sure that what the president has decided is in fact being executed. But it is not the NSC's job to actually do the execution, excepting maybe in very rare cases. If something is super sensitive or super secret, there may be some occasional cases where the NSC can step forward and be more operational. For example, the President Nixon's opening to China might have been a case that was pretty closely held in the NSC system, or the recent opening to Cuba would be maybe a similar case. But that's a rare exception. We have departments and agencies, we have career professionals, we have veterans in our system. Let's let them do their job, and let's empower them to do their job. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Crocker. Okay, Ambassador Pickering, are you there?
Yes, I am, Paula. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Please, we'd be delighted to hear from you.
It's amazing.
Let me try to be brief. I've been listening on the telephone and know how boring it is to listen to squawk boxes. I have 4 quick points I want to make, but I want to begin with one additional. I just want to emphasize that the effort we undertook was clearly designed to improve, not to reprove. And so it's not an effort here to put a finger on any particular period or any particular series of services in the NSC. We deeply appreciate the sacrifice and indeed the strength and the commitment of all of them. I have 4 S words that I want to put out just very quickly: shaping, staffing, strategy, and size. And very quickly for each of those. On shaping, the really important thing is that the president needs to lead with initiatives, not to be responsive only to everything that comes in over the transom on a regular basis. And this requires a group of people around the president in the National Security Council staff and in the agencies that looks ahead, that finds opportunities, that in fact then promotes those. And options, in my view, are important, and honest brokering is important here. And we have recommended that the NSC look from time to time at task forces which may well integrate, based on mission agency leadership, if I could put it that way, the focus on particular problem sets that are going to continue from one administration to another. On staffing, highly agree with what's been said, and indeed, I feel like the old Washington conundrum, everything has been said, but not everybody has said it yet. But I will try to avoid that and merely state that staffing should be highly professional, should be continuous, should draw very heavily on the mission agencies, and should have an opportunity to know and understand how to work with those powerhouses who get the budget to carry out the work and contribute to the strategy. I think strategy is very significant. We have no particular process in our government to take lessons learned and incorporate those in future looks. And that's a very significant role for strategy. I think it's also important that the public documents we tend to produce with for strategy are basically almost everything for everybody. They're highly political. There's nothing wrong with them in that sense, but they don't represent strategy that looks at objectives, as we heard from Steve Hadley, or looks, in my view, at the clear need for priorities, which are always hard to decide. They're often very sensitive. They are things, however, that presidents need to have and need to have in mind and need support for. And I think that's significant. Size in itself has been a measure in some ways, I think, of some of the problem areas in which we have seen the NSC move into operational activities. You've heard about it. And obviously, the more people you have, the more opportunities you have to dig deeper into depth about how things are being carried out and to try to work to carry those out. Presidents are frustrated, in fact, that they want to be sure that things are carried out well. But empowering and indeed working with the mission agencies and then tracking what they do and then absorbing lessons learned, is my view, are very important pieces of what we have put together in the study. I'm talking over a long distance. You've heard a lot of palaver up until now. All of it, in my view, extremely important in reinforcing our efforts. But I'll sign off now and hope you can then move on to Dan and the rest of the conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Pickering, and really appreciate your being on the phone with us today. Thank you. Great. Daniel.
So I'll be brief so that we can get to the questions. I really just wanted to make 2 points, one on mission and one on size. On mission, echoing what Steve said, on the legal side, I think it's important that the mission be to coordinate legal advice. And I think each of those 3 words is important. It should be coordinating, not itself providing the legal advice. It's important to involve the agency experts, and there's a lot of expertise around the government. It's important not to try to cherry pick and in order to get the advice you want, but to include those who know most about it. That's both in order to get the right advice and to engender, I think, trust both within the government and within the public in the legal process. It's important that it be legal advice and not policy advice. Lawyers should be providing legal advice. The policy is usually much more interesting, and so there's a lot of temptation for the lawyers, I think, to try to get into the policy, masquerading it a little bit as legal, and I think that's something that needs to be resisted. And it needs to be advice. Lawyers are not decision makers. As Steve said many times, lawyers should be supporting clients. Sometimes lawyers meet, but if there's a decision-making meeting and you look around the room and it's all lawyers, there's something very wrong with that process. Second, on size, to echo what a couple of people said, the size actually I think does matter here. As one of the people I interviewed said, if you have a lot of smart lawyers around the White House, they're going to find something to do. And it's almost certainly going to be something that shouldn't be done by lawyers at the White House. So I do think it's important to keep that size under control. And that's really all I had to add.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to pose a few questions, and then we're going to go to you, because we have, in fact, over 30 minutes, actually, for our conversation. Let me come back to a point that Steve Hadley made. I was struck by his point when he referred to, and he worked at the NSC during Kissinger's time, referring to Kissinger and Brzezinski, the world has changed. And looking at how our international environment has changed and how it's incumbent upon us to also revisit how our institutions are structured to be the most effective and efficient.
Yes.
Can we discuss that a bit more? I know there have
Yeah.
been criticisms, maybe in different ways of how we can improve, but let's flip it. Let's look at what the world is today and how these changes could really benefit us in terms of the reform for the NSC.
The first thing I think that's worth focusing on is there may be more issues. As General Jones says, the list for the president grows every day. And a number of the people that we interviewed offered that observation. That said, as any acolyte of Scowcroft knows, the president has a limited amount of time. And in some ways, the president has fewer chips to put on the table than meet the eye when you first get to the White House. So you can put more issues on the list, but you only get 24 hours a day, and you only get so much presidential influence. So part of the discussion, I think, is the need to prioritize in this vast new world we're facing, if you will, those issues that are really White House level issues that really deserve National Security Council time, and to develop the discipline to delegate to the departments and agencies where you have the expertise to say the president cares a lot about X, but he's not going to run it here at the White House. We're not going to staff up a 3-person directorate to worry about X if the State Department has an assistant secretary that does that. So I think I think an incoming administration has got to look at that kind of discipline. I offer these observations with these 2 guys who have run the whole thing at great personal peril. Y'all ought to add something to this.
Steve Hadley has a thumbs up. General, thumbs up. All right, thumbs
Okay.
up. Daniel, do you have anything to add to that? All right, let me pose a different question. The NSC and then the National Economic Council, there have been evolutions. You have the National Economic Council. I remember there were some who said, well, is that a good move because do you want to put economics over here? Address that, and how is that
The person to address that is Eric Melby, who's sitting there. Eric looked at international economic issues for us with General Scowcroft. If this isn't a good day to talk about the political importance of economic activities, I can't think of a better one. You're not.
But let me give the flip
Yeah.
side. The counter to it is it should be integrated.
Yes.
You know, that it should be integrated. And sometimes when you divorce things, they take on a life of their own. They fall
Yes.
into certain singular cones. So that's sort of the counter that some would argue, well, that melding before actually was very impactful.
Yes.
And then also the Department of Treasury is not yet a permanent member of the NSC. So that's another piece that comes into play here in terms of it. Steve Hadley wanted to say something. Do we have a mic? We have a mic right over here, Steve. Excuse me. Thank you.
Just because it's separate doesn't mean it can't be integrated.
Okay.
So I think the reason it was established as a separate was because someone needed to be looking at economic issues full-time. But we had a number of meetings where they were joint NEC-NSC meetings. And I and the head of the National Economic Council co-chaired the meeting. And the person on the NSC staff who did international economics dual reported to the National Security Advisor and the head of the Economic Council. So there was an effort to get the best of both worlds, to get someone working the economic issues full-time in the way the National Security Council could not, but also ensure that they were integrated into the overall NSC process.
Okay, good point. Eric, would you like to add something to this? We got the mic right there.
Yeah. I've always liked
Please.
picking on Eric because he has good answers.
No, I don't think the structure matters so much as long as you get the integration, because you know, I think it was Scowcroft was the first person to invite the Treasury Secretary to all the NSC meetings. So even though he wasn't a formal member, he was there, and you had that input all the time. Whether you have a separate, and even back then there was an Economic Policy Council which was more focused on domestic policy, and the NSC staff was working international policy. That frankly didn't make a lot of sense because domestic economic policy and international are very much the same thing. I mean, you can't do one without the other. So how you structure it internally, as long as there's the coordination and there's the confidence among the people in the agencies, I think that's the important
Should the
thing.
Secretary of Treasury become a permanent member of the National Security Council? By the way, that's as distinct from the staff, the council, and when the president chairs the
I think that
council
would make a lot of sense, just given the nature of the issues that one deals with now.
All right. All right.
Paula, could I just jump in on that?
Are you still
I
with
think
us?
there's nothing
Great.
wrong with this. This is Tom. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Glad you're still with us. I would have
look,
deferred to you.
There's nothing wrong with the Treasury becoming a permanent member of the NSC. They don't sit in on every issue, but economics is increasingly important. However, what you're suggesting is something we've just heard comments about, opening up an opportunity for the Congress to meddle. And my view is the President can bring the Secretary of Treasury into any meeting he likes, so can the NSC advisor. You should leave it that way and not open it up for further legislation because, in fact, a legislative wrangle at this particular time, I think, is going to produce the sort of results we have deep concerns about.
All right, good. Thank you. And delighted you're still with us because I'm sure there are going to be other issues that will come out here that it would be great for you to address. General Jones, could we get the mic here? Thank you.
In 2009, Mike Froman was assigned to work for both Larry Summers and me, and was a bridge between the two councils, and that worked very well.
All right, thank you for that. I put that issue out there because it's one that I have heard, and I thought as part of this discussion of reform, that some people have had different issues on that. Let's go to all of you. I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions. Harlan, over here. If you'll introduce yourself formally to everyone, please.
I'm Harlan Ullman from the Atlantic Council. This is a long overdue and needed report, and I congratulate people for doing it. An observation, a question. It seems to me that overshadowing this is the National Security Act, which will be 70 years old next year. And if anything needs reform, it's that. Now, that may be a bridge too far. But the other thing that's troubling is the fact that politics has emerged today where White Houses have become increasingly controlling of the political agenda. And I'm not sure how you turn that around. My question is this: how do you get this report to Hillary Clinton? And if you read her website, she seems to have made up her mind about what she wants to do, and Donald Trump, who seems to be supremely disinterested. So how do you get the two likely candidates to focus on this before the election?
By the way, I'm delighted you asked that question because I wanted to give the floor a chance. On my note here was, what's next? How do you move this forward? Gentlemen, and also the first question, if you want to make a comment about the National Security Council Act.
Yeah, I mean, I would sort of, I think, echo what Tom said, which is, you know, in terms of the National Security Council itself and who's on it and how it's structured, I mean, there's a statute there, but that is not the only way to change how things work. And really, this is a presidential creation or presidential structure, and I don't think you need I don't think you need to change the statute in order to make any of these reforms that we've been talking about, or in order to change who comes to the meetings or which meetings they do or don't come to. And I agree that it's probably a lot easier and probably far preferable for the president to deal with this himself or herself than to try to get Congress to legislate in what will probably be a fairly a less nuanced matter than you might want.
But the National Security Act is far broader than the NSA.
No, it is, and there are other parts of it. There are other parts of it, but in terms of what we're talking about here, which is the National Security Council structure and the size and the mission, I don't think you need statutory changes to do the things we're talking about. There are other things in the National Security Act that may well be appropriate for reconsideration.
Okay, David?
On the getting politics out of the NSC or whatever, I have one of the telling moments of my life, which I know Hadley will relate to, and that is, I thought we had a brilliant counterterrorism opportunity in my first few months, and yet I thought, were it to go wrong, it would have some political consequences. So I wandered over to see Brent, and I said, gee, we really have a swell idea here, and we could do X, but you know, if it goes badly, it'll have some political costs for the president. There was this long pause, and he said, David, we don't do politics here. We do foreign policy. Governor Sununu is 90 feet down the hallway. If you want to do politics, you got to go see him. So that comment goes to the heart of the staffing, the comments we made about the backgrounds of the senior staff, the selection of the security advisor. It's imperative that the White House run a professional foreign policy structure. Politics is something else. In terms of getting these things adopted, don't just sit there. We're going to need everybody in this room and then some involved in it. There's this bizarre word of socializing an idea. I'm too old to really understand what that means, but we're obviously trying to talk to both of the campaigns, and we'll be doing that. We'll be on Capitol Hill, which is where there are 535 members. There are also a lot of staff people that will be moving into positions in a new administration. The best advice on this whole issue has come from General Jim Mattis, who said, David, it took us a couple years after Vietnam to rebuild the Army. It will take us a couple years of discussion here in town, I would guess, to try to get the NSC structured in a way that those of us in the professional community would feel comfortable with. In Pickering, where are you? This is an important subject.
Well, in fact, I was going to ask, are you still with us? Because I would think this would be a topic you'd be interested in commenting on. Are you still with us, Ambassador Pickering?
Yeah, I am. And my sense is that we've been trying for months to reach out. We've been providing copies, been providing briefings. We hope to be having personal conversations with people who are putatively part of the campaign and putatively part of the campaign foreign and security policy structure. And I think that's basically the answer to the question. And we intend to take it now more publicly because it's become a public document and I think can help to reinforce the notion that this is important, and it makes sense. And then a number of people, I think General Jones in particular, mentioned that this is a very early and important first decision of the president, and it may well be time for us to think a little bit about how we could translate some of the ideas in the report into things that might represent at least a straw man draft for the first security directive. Those are all ideas we've talked about, and they all lie in the future, but they're all, I think, constructive parts of what we can do coming out of this study.
All right, great. Thank you for those comments. Other questions? Yes, please, ma'am. And if you'll introduce yourself, and we're getting the mic over to you.
I'm Patty Morrissey. I work for the National Counterterrorism Center, Directorate of Strategic Operational Planning. Just started there after 8 years of other jobs in DNI. But I'm in assessment, so this is a very important discussion. And for those of you who don't know DSOP, it's meant to be sort of a policy hybrid arm to the NSC for counterterrorism. The question I have is, looking back at PNZR, looking back at Leon's fabulous anticipatory governance thing, which I was able to participate in as part of his team, it seems like the core problem has been how the NSC is enabled to manage the community. From an outsider's perspective, and not having the chance to have read the report yet, the management piece, the day-to-day integration, the identifying the right people to be in the room so that the NSC can truly do their job supporting the president and not have to get into the execution, it seems like that's the thing we keep trying to grab onto. And I guess I'd like to, throw that out to General Jones too, because as he was very involved in PNZR, that, why hasn't that piece happened yet? That management piece that allows the grease to be, to be put into the system to make the interagency integration happen.
Okay, thank you for that. General, if we get the mic over here. Oh, you don't have, no, he does. Oh, you have this on, so you can speak right to us. Okay.
So as I understand, the question is about integration?
Yes.
I was a little fuzzy in the
Yes.
background. The president, at least on our watch, the president met with the, first of all, let me say something about the NCTC. I thought it's one of the great creations of our time. I really admired the work and the cohesion that all the participants around that table brought to bear. I thought, the president met once a week, at least, with the NCTC and the law enforcement community, separate from the regular national security crowd. But we tried to focus on making sure that the right people were around the table when the discussions were on a particular subject. As a matter of fact, we had a motto that said, if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu. And there's some truth to that. And that had a forcing function all unto itself. And because national security became such a broader issue, it was my view that the Secretary of Energy should be at the table and the Secretary of Treasury and so on and so forth. But I thought, and a lot of time we're criticized for taking so long to make decisions because we were discussing things ad nauseum. But, my recollection was that we made a concerted effort to make sure that the right people were at the table. And I thought the president's weekly meeting with the NCTC community and the law enforcement community was very, very useful.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you for that. Do you want to add anything here?
Yeah, I have a thought.
Please, go ahead, David.
When you read the document, you'll see the word management used a lot, that we want to see a security advisor who has some background in managing assets and a staff, down to the junior staff, down to just special assistants, ought to have some background in management, and they ought to have the personal standing to be able to coordinate people who are assistant secretaries, the J3, the director of counterterrorism, whatever. There is an argument that we haven't spent as much time on looking at people's management skills as we have looking at their professional expertise in a particular area, a region or whatever. And when the NSC is supposed to be pulling people together, and in counterterrorism, you typically have tight turning radiuses in terms of making decisions. So if you don't have people that are used to making decisions and running effective group meetings, things go too slow. And the bells don't go off frequently with much lead time when things are going to go wrong.
Okay. We have two questions. We're going to take you in the front, and we have him in the back. Okay. So we'll get a mic here to her, and then a mic to
I'm
David
Faye
in the back.
Mokhtar, I'm Atlantic Council member. Just as a curiosity, how important it is for the NSC staff to be diversified as far as their backgrounds are concerned? Thank you.
I'm a form follows function. I want diversity that makes things work better. And so I guess my sense is the thing that drives me most about diversity is to look at a series of challenges and then say, but we never brought anybody on board who knows about this or that or whatever. And so I think that's my approach to that issue, and that is there are sometimes men, sometimes women, sometimes whatever, who are the experts in X. In my day, by far, the smartest analysts on counterterrorism were almost entirely women. The CIA's Counterterrorism Center looked like the Los Angeles Police Operations Center, if you will, which is also staffed almost entirely by women. And so there are situations in which you want to say, please don't send me a guy because they get too excited when things are going wrong. Women have an amazing ability to watch the world go up in smoke and be okay about it, which is really quite impressive. Basically, I just like to, were I to be really young and think about this again, it would be just, have we filled our needs for expertise? It's critical for the country that we don't leave unfilled blocks.
By the way, I ordinarily wouldn't jump in and do this, but I wanted to make a comment on your question before we go to David. Diversity to me means a number of things. It's not just only the gender issue, but actually when I served on the NSC, I was one of 3 people, we were in our 20s. And actually, so diversity could mean age, by the way. And during my time, I started actually at the very end of the Carter administration with Brzezinski, and then left when Carlucci came in. But why I mention it is because there was diversity in terms of the age. You had some very seasoned, very experienced people. You had some, like myself, that this was more the beginning. But we were thrown in the mix to actually provide new ideas and maybe embarrass ourselves a few times, but seriously provide new ideas, new thinking. And I thought that was a real asset in terms of the structure of NSC. There were also people detailed from different agencies. That matters too, because the skills of somebody detailed from DOD or from the agency or wherever it might be, they're going to bring in a new functional outlook. And then finally, I'd say there was also diversity injected into this because of some of the consultantships. One of the consultants who really was a very important player during my time, he's now deceased, is Jan Novak or Jan Jozański, who many would remember, and he went from administration to administration. It wasn't an issue about being, a Democrat or Republican. It was about rendering really solid experience that was necessary at the time. You were going to comment, and then General Jones.
I just got to say this: the average age of our core group it probably was 72, 73. Without Levin, it would have been 78. The age thing was Jason Kirby. Jason very kindly reminded us that we were older. And some of the problems the world faced weren't really hanging around when we were there on the front lines. And so a lot of the creative writing on the task force necessity and the multidiscipline approach to some of these problems came out of the fact that Colonel Kirby is a very persistent and polite partner who made this document a lot better in that particular area.
Thank you. General, did you have a point you want to make? Please.
I think the diversity kind of happens by you have to watch it, but it kind of happens by itself. But one of the things that makes it work is that if the agencies, when they send people to the NSC, put a value on that. And on this score, not all agencies are the same.
Yeah.
Because I see some agencies when people rotated out of the NSC and went back and went to significant jobs in their parent agency because of the experiences they gained. Right. But there are other agencies didn't necessarily feel that way. And so it's extremely important that the quality of the people that are detailed to the NSC, as opposed to the ones who were hired by the NSC, there's two groups here. And I think that what really affects the NSC is when the detailees are out of whack in relation to the more permanent people. And sometimes they do that simply out of economics. You know, they just don't have the money to pay for it. So if you get too many of the detailees and they start cycling around fast, you lose a lot of quality. You lose quality work, and you lose people at a cyclic rate that's not good for the.
Those are good points.
For the work.
David, if you'll introduce yourself.
Thanks. David Goldwyn, Atlantic Council, and I had the privilege of serving at both the State Department and the Energy Department. My question goes to how the task force dealt with how the NSC should address questions of increasing complexity. Because it strikes me, one of the problems, one of the pushes for centralization is that problems don't fit into a neat State Department or Energy Department or Treasury box. And cooperation doesn't come easily by the agencies when it comes to either providing resources or providing contributions. And so there's a big drive to have very hands-on coordination by the NSC because it's hard to put everybody together at the table. So how does the proposed structure deal with those challenges?
I'm going to ask Ambassador Pickering, are you there? Are you with us? Because if you are, I thought you might want to take a stab at this first.
Yes, I am, Paul, and I listened to David's question. I think it's a very good and very useful one. I think that one suggestion we made, which I talked about in the presentation I made, was to look at task forces as having some value for larger problems with strong persistence and with a very strong need for interagency cooperation and perhaps even a need for funding that doesn't have to be driven by the usual theft from departments already committed funding or agencies already committed funding, but that it becomes additional supplemental funding of some kind for those sorts of issues. And that was my experience in dealing with Columbia and with my colleagues in that regard. And it was a complex question. It had many departments and agencies of government involved. And that worked after a fashion, not perfectly, but it had a lot to say for it. And we think that with some of the key issues that come up, something like that could be extremely useful. I think in addition to that, obviously, the National Security Council lead in complex issues involving a wide number of interagency relationships is very important. But having people on the staff who have come from the agencies as well is helpful in opening and smoothing the kind of relationships that are necessary to get the agencies to bring the best of their thinking and activities to the table and be prepared to put forward their resources when the time comes to make those kinds of solutions happen for the president. It is very much in that respect the fact that it is a White House organization serving the president can help to pull a lot of questions in the right direction. I know that one comment that I received in the opposite direction was also important. The more the National Security Council tends to become operational, the more it tends to freeze out other agencies, and other agencies then take the kind of let's sit on the sideline and watch what these people think they can do. Not a good relationship. It's a degenerative relationship. And so it is that kind of question of maybe new structure in some cases, stronger leadership in other cases, and a very strong commitment to whole of government activities where they are clearly necessary in some of the broader questions we have to undertake, and some of the more complex questions we have to undertake are all part of the challenge. And I think meet, at least, are met by some of the thoughts that we have put on the table.
Let's hear from Steve Hadley, and you have a mic, I realize, still with you, please. And then we'll come to David and Daniel.
A small point, but in addition to the task forces, which the report talks about, there's also empowering and enabling cabinet officials. So, for example, Condi Rice as Secretary of State, Hank Paulson as Secretary of Treasury worked together to manage our relationship with China and integrated elements. Condi Rice as Secretary of State, Bob Gates, Secretary of Defense, did a number of things where I would just basically send them off, you guys coordinate, go do it, keep me informed so I can keep the president informed. But again, it doesn't all have to go through the NSC, interagency funnel. You can actually enable and empower cabinet secretaries to work together to execute and implement broad presidential level guidance, just keeping the National Security Advisor and the President informed.
That's an excellent point. I hope you heard that. Did you hear that back there? It carried? Good. Just want to make sure. David or Daniel, do you have anything to add to this?
No, I mean, I agree with everything said, and it's almost, to me, it's almost funny that we've gotten to the stage where you talk about the NSC having to empower cabinet officers to go and do these things, which you would think, that's their job. Why is it you have to do? But I do think the process has gotten to the point where, unfortunately, that is work you have to do. Too much of it has been pulled into the White House.
Okay. We have
Yeah,
time
let
for
me
one.
just add one thing from here,
Please.
Paula. I think what Steve had to say was terrific. My view is it should be the regular option, the ordinary option, the option almost always followed. That is, entrust the cabinet officers with the responsibility and get them to be sure they coordinate and get the job done as much as you possibly can.
Okay, thank you for that. We had two hands up here. I think we'll take both of them, and then we're going to close. So, and we're going to let you both state them, introduce yourselves, and then we'll have responses.
I'm Richard Mintz, friend of the Atlantic Council. You have two presidential candidates, one arguably the least qualified in American history in foreign affairs, the other one arguably the most qualified. I wish you luck in terms of determining which will be the most difficult challenge for reforming the National Security Council. My question, however, is how the National Security Council relates to foreign governments, international partners, and whether or not you considered that in any of your thinking, the confusion and lack of clarity about where policy is made and what that means for how the rest of the world views the White House and the administration.
We'll get an answer to that in a minute, and then you have a question up here. If you'll introduce yourself as well.
Okay. Diane Perlman, George Mason School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. So this may be another kind of diversity, but in terms of bodies of knowledge and areas of expertise, that I'm wondering whether you integrate bodies of knowledge from conflict analysis, social sciences, political psychology, on tension reduction, reversing cycles of violence, which seem to me to be related to national security, even things like perception and such things. If they're
All right. Let's go to David and Daniel first, and then Ambassador Pickering, I'll give you a chance to comment and sign off. And I finally will ask either Steve and General Jones if they have any final words. But David and Daniel, on these two questions.
Very quickly, I'm the only person in the room that knows that Ambassador Pickering is 15 minutes away from a dinner reservation in France.
Oh, okay.
So I'm going to be really
Okay.
quick.
All right.
It's on the NSC stumbling into diplomatic activity, if you will. One of the complaints we got strongly from a lot of people was that part of the size problem was that embassies began to entertain the NSC. And it's always fun to go to dinner at somebody's embassy. It's a nice thing to do. So you found NSC staff assuming functions that are normally done by State Department officers. And if you're reporting back to your government and you say, I just had special assistant to the president here at my embassy, well, that seems more exciting than having the principal deputy or whatever. So that was something that really did concern us. It is a fundamental area of friction between state and the NSC. I'm not sure I understood exactly what your question is, but I have a suspicion that the next 50 years with ISIS is going to relate a lot to what you're asking about. We need to step back and think about that conflict and what we can do to engage more effectively, if I understood that.
She's shaking her head,
Yeah.
yes, so, okay. More.
Exactly, yeah. It's not going to be won by a kinetic engagement in Raqqa or whatever.
Okay, Daniel, do you want to say?
Just briefly on the first point, I was at the NSC 3 different times, and one of the big differences between the first time I was there and the last time I was there was, from my perception, the amount of interaction there was between the staff and foreign embassy and other officials, which was very rare in my experience, at least when I was first there, and had become extremely common the last time I was there. And I think some of that is, again, a function of there were just a lot more people around to do the meetings, and some of it was it had evolved over time to be more acceptable. And I know Steve, one of Steve's instructions to me was, which I didn't need the instruction, was I should not be having those meetings. But I was surprised how often I would get calls from people saying they wanted to come in and meet with me as opposed to go and meet with the State Department or really where they or the Justice Department or wherever they should be meeting to talk about that. On your point, again, I think this part of the answer to that is making sure you're coordinating broadly around the government, because there's just no way, even with a huge NSC staff, there's no way you're going to have the knowledge and the experience and the exposure that the far vaster staffs and the departments and agencies will have and can bring to bear those kinds of areas of knowledge and expertise that you just don't have at the White House.
All right. Ambassador Pickering.
He's gone to
Oh, he's gone.
He's gone
so
to
he has gone. All right.
This is serious. I had a serious heads up from him that said,
I thought you
we're
said
going
we had
out to eat.
Okay, all right. Anyhow, all right. Steve and General Jones, any final comments that you'd like to make before we close?
Make 3 things. One,
please.
I think one of the hardest challenges is getting information from outside the government bubble into the White House in a form that it's usable. And it's really hard, and I don't think any administration has solved it. Secondly, meeting with foreign leaders at my level, I would meet with a foreign leader, but I would always do it in coordination with the Secretary of State and Condi Rice so that I was reinforcing her message. And if there was a reason she didn't want me to meet with one, I didn't meet with them. So the coordination is key. Third, size of this staff relates to the integration issue. What the NSC staff needs to do is help integrate across the stovepipes of the various government agencies and departments. If the staff gets too big, it reproduces those departments in the NSC staff, and it loses the integration function. I used to say, I would like more information in fewer heads, because that way people are able to see the connections and do that integration. That's another reason why you want to keep it small, keep it senior.
Thank you. General?
2 points. One is I think the issue of deconfliction, if you will, or coordination in the government starts with the principals and the National Security Advisor. And I think the National Security Advisor has a special responsibility to stay very closely aligned with the principals, with the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Treasury, directly, and to create the conditions where, by virtue of leadership of the National Security Council staff and the principals, that they know that National Security Advisor is an honest broker and is working hard to make sure that those functions don't get blurred, especially at the State Department level. And I think that's on the National Security Advisor to do that. And it's hard. It's difficult, but it can be done. And so it involves a lot of time on telephones, all hours of the day, regular meetings, but it really can be done. And if you don't do that, you're not going to have that cohesion. You're going to have the friction points. So it's really important that the National Security Advisor understand that he has to build or she has to build that relationship. And that's an ongoing function. The second point is many other countries in the world are copying us now, and they're developing their own national security advisors. I don't know, 10 years ago there weren't so many, but just in the last 10 years, people have come to the United States and say, we're going to have a national security advisor. Great Britain is a good example. And so that's a community all unto itself. And I know Steve did and I did. I spent a lot of time on video teleconferences every week with 4 principal national security advisors, then 8, then 12. And it's a special community. And its essentiality is that the heads of state want to have somebody they can turn to on a multiplicity of subjects at the drop of a hat, and have something, have some product that they can use and they can know about. And so there is deconfliction that has to take place, but there's also the positive aspect is there's great coordination. If the coordination works, then the system works.
Thank you both. And my apologies, I think there were some other questions, but we wanted to run on time and we spilled over. But please join me in thanking the panelists, the authors, and also General Jones and Steve Hadley.
Thank you.